Okay, so this is just some final advice for Module 9 after you've done everything, including the practice tests, and think that you are pretty close to being ready. The Module 9 test is challenging, and many people take 2 or 3 times to get it right, and usually they are making the same kinds of mistakes over and over, and so here I'm going to try to point out what those are and show you how to avoid them. Now, there is nothing new in this video whatsoever. Everything I say is covered in the lectures, and it is pointedly covered in the study advice document directly above this one, so please study that very carefully first. If you haven't done that, just turn this video off and go back to that document and read it very, very carefully. Then come back and make sure that what I am saying reflects your understanding of it. Okay, so let's attack this by just looking at a sentence that isn't terribly simple, but also not terribly complicated. Okay, so some dogs like chocolate. Don't feed your dogs chocolate. I'm sure you know that. Chocolate is, in fact, poisonous to dogs. But it is true that some dogs like it. Now, how would we translate that? I'm going to assume that you know that the some dogs strongly suggests the use of the existential quantifier. And so you should begin with, there exists an X such that X is a dog. That's our translation of some dogs. And we want to say is that that thing that is a dog likes chocolate. So likes is what we call a binary relation, likes. And we want to say that X likes chocolate. Okay, now, do we write this? X likes chocolate? No, we do not, right? And why not? Because chocolate is not a name, chocolate is a property, so we need to use the predicate C. So that's the very first common mistake that you need to avoid. Always ask yourself if something is a name or it's a predicate, and if what I'm saying here makes you uneasy, then you are definitely not ready to take this test. You definitely need to go back and study the videos again. Okay, so what we want to say is there exists an X such that X is a dog, and for all Y, and we want to say Y is chocolate, and we want to say X likes Y. Okay, now I have purposely not put any operators in here, any propositional logic operators, so we know one needs to go there, we know one needs to go there. Before I get to that point, I want to point out something else very important, and that is that I didn't just stack these quantifiers up on the outside of the formula. Okay, so I didn't just write there exists an X such that for all Y, parentheses, etc. And the reason I didn't do that is because it's much easier to read and understand the proposition if you distribute the quantifiers into the formula as far as they can go while still keeping it a woof. So the reason that the universal quantifier is here in the middle is because there is no Y here, and so the universal quantifier can have no impact on this particular formula. Okay, so this is all good. There exists an X such that X is a dog for all Y. Y is chocolate. X likes Y. Now, what logical operators are we going to use here? Well, let's look at the universal first. Some dogs like chocolate, okay? So for all y, if y is chocolate, then x likes y, right? That is the correct operator to use there. You will, however, if you aren't reading these formulas out loud to yourself, be tempted to write and instead. Now, you won't do this if you actually read what this means, because if you write and rather than if then, what this says is for all y, y is chocolate and x likes y. That is telling you something extremely radical, which is that everything in the world is in fact chocolate. Okay? So that is a very common error and a very important one to avoid. Putting the universal quantifier with a conjunction, having the universal range over a conjunction inappropriately. Now, of course, it's not always inappropriate. There are plenty of times when it would be right. For example, if we had a proposition like I wrote the E back, everything is fine and dandy, of course, this doesn't say if it's fine, then it's dandy. It says everything is fine and dandy. So for all x, x is fine, and in fact, x is dandy. Okay? So there, having the universal range over the conjunction, perfectly legitimate. Here, it's a bad choice. Okay, so now let's return to what this operator. And before we do that, let's make it clear that we need parentheses here and here, right? And the reason for that is that if we didn't have a parentheses in front of the D, then the quantifier would only be ranging, the existential quantifier would only be ranging over the D, and it would not be ranging over this x, which would mean that this x was not bound by a quantifier, and therefore it would not be a woof. Okay, so this gets us to our final point, and that is very often with the existential, you will be inclined to write a conditional inappropriately. Okay? Now suppose you put a conditional here. This would say there exists an x such that if it's a dog, okay, make sure you read that out loud to yourself. There is something such that if it's a dog, then for all y, if y is chocolate, then x likes y. Now, ask yourself, what in the heck does that even mean? Well, one way of answering that is to remember that the conditional, if A, then B, is logically equivalent to not A or B. Right? That's your rule of material implication, the equivalence of material implication. And so what this is really saying is there exists something that is either not a dog or it likes chocolate. Now that clearly and intuitively is nothing like a translation of some dogs like chocolate. Okay, so what is the proper translation? The proper translation is simply a conjunction. So some dogs like chocolate, there exists an x such that x is a dog and it likes chocolate. Okay, so of all the mistakes I've discussed just now, this is actually the most common one. Incorrectly associating a conditional with an existential. So let's just make sure we've got this dialed in by thinking of an even simpler sentence. Suppose I wrote, instead of some dogs like chocolate, some dogs are chocolate. Okay? Now that's a weird thing to say if you're thinking of chocolate as a candy, but chocolate is also a color, so you might think about a chocolate Labrador. Either way, some dogs are chocolate. Now, there exists an X such that what? Would you say there exists an X such that if it's a dog, then it's chocolate? I hope you've gotten to the point where you would say, no, of course not. We just learned that that would be a conjunction and that the meaning of the conditional statement is nothing close to this. So when would you actually associate the existential with the conditional? Well, there are plenty of sentences where it would really make sense. Suppose we said something like, Sally is a mean drunk. Okay? Now, what we mean by that is if Sally is drunk, then she is. So from this we could infer that there is someone who is mean if she's drunk, right? That would be the more natural English way of saying it. If we wanted to say it more perspicuously, for logic's sake, we would say there is someone such that if she's drunk, she's mean. In any case, if we were to translate this into predicate logic, we would say there exists an X such that if X is mean, then X is drunk. So essentially what a sentence like this does is that it says that for something to have one property is conditional on having another property. And the kinds of properties that this makes sense for, and this is kind of philosophical and maybe you don't want to think this deeply, is properties that are not really essential, right? So if something's a dog, it doesn't go back and forth between being a dog and a cat. A dog is just a dog, the way that a human is a human for its entire existence. But dogs and humans and all sorts of other things will instantiate properties as a result of instantiating other properties. So Sally is mean when she's drunk. Peter is happy when he gets paid. All of those, it would be appropriate to translate in this way. Okay? So if you understand this, then the only thing that's really going to prevent you from passing the Module 9 test on the first or at least the second try is just not taking the time to read what you've written. If you distribute the quantifiers the way I suggest, and when you read it, it's very clear to you, you don't feel like you're guessing at all, it's very clear to you what they're saying, then you're probably going to be in pretty darn good shape. Okay?